All right, welcome back to The Popular Show with me, James A. Smith. I couldn't be more excited than I am to welcome to the show for the first time Tariq Ali. Tariq Ali is a historian, a novelist, activist, political theorist, revolutionary socialist, a great educator, and the only, I think, major left-wing theorist to be the subject of a song by the Rolling Stones. Thank you for coming on The Popular Show, Tariq Ali. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, James, and very good to be on your show.
For the full interview with Tariq Ali, get over to patreon.com/thepopularpod, where subscribers can also bag a free Popular Show beer mat.
All part of the plan.
Tariq, in the past 12 months, you've released two books, which have both, to my mind, landed on maybe slightly unexpected soil or have kind of emerged in context that might seem slightly uncanny relative to their contents. The first was the 40-year war in Afghanistan, which collected your journalism on the country dating back to the 1980s 80s to mark the occasion of Joe Biden's withdrawal of America from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. And this is a wonderful book to read. I can illustrate that by saying that in this book, I've got a piece of paper with the address of the Golden Lion pub in Soho, where I was sat reading the book, and I was so engrossed that my bag was stolen out from under my seat. So I've got the police number written down on this slip of paper tucked in the book as a souvenir. But anyway, I was clearly enjoying the book. That book appeared, as I say, following this withdrawal from Afghanistan, which we on the show welcomed Joe Biden weathering his first ever critical press response from the centrist media in the US, only for it to be followed by the freezing of the country's assets and the ramping up of sanctions that have basically left the country in an absolutely crippled state, just as the US turns its attention to a quite novel kind of proxy war in Ukraine. Your book begins with the Russians in Afghanistan and your early protests against the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. And when Putin went in, Hillary Clinton was making sort of ominous comparisons between Russia going into Ukraine and Russia going to Afghanistan, which of course couldn't help but be ghosted by America's own misadventures first in Afghanistan, and who knows what she was unconsciously blurting out about the interests in Eastern Europe now. Putin also dressed up his rationale for the invasion in language that seemed to parody the language of the war on terror from the language of the West, that is. What lessons do you see in Afghanistan and all that work that you did covering that for either Biden or Putin in Ukraine today?
Well, I think they're very different issues, very different parts of the world. The Russians went into Afghanistan in 1979, December 1979, because a government that they had not actually put in power themselves, but which had come to power via a military coup. Left-wing army officers had taken power and taken the country and got rid of the government of the day. This frightened the Shah of Iran considerably, because he thought it was the Russians, and he was totally opposed to this business. But it wasn't the Russians. They probably wouldn't have been in favor if asked, should we take the country over? But once it became clear that Iran and the United States were determined to get rid of this government and were pretty actively engaged in destabilizing it, then the Russians decided to go in. And the Russians' decision to go into Afghanistan, as I predicted, unfortunately, but correctly, united a large chunk of Afghan people against foreign occupation. The one thing the Afghans have always been very strong on is resisting occupation. They defeated the British in the 19th century, and the Americans helped them to defeat the Russians. And so the third invasion of Afghanistan by the United States angered them even more, saying these were people supposed to be our friends. If they wanted Osama bin Laden, if that was their only function, we could have done a deal, but they've taken our country. And so the third phase of the Afghan wars began, and it was obvious to me and others that this couldn't be a permanent solution at all. Because once you send in Western troops, and this, what was it called? Operation Enduring Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing endured. There was no freedom except in the green zone. And the Taliban and other groups bided their time, which is what the Pakistani military intelligence had told them to do. Do not pick a fight with the Americans now, you'll be destroyed. Just go and rest in the villages or come over across the border, we'll look after you, but do not resist. Actually, it was intelligent advice. So it's once the United States and the NATO countries began getting unpopular, they were bombing weddings, they were bombing villages, the usual paraphernalia that comes with a military occupation by a Western power, a big power of a smaller country set into motion. And so what I described in that book was my observation of that war for 40 years and why it was predictable. Now, the Russian business in Ukraine is different. It's different in this way, that Ukraine was part of Russia for a long, long time. Over half the population spoke Russian, regardless of their ethnic origins. There were a large number of Russians in 4 parts of the Ukraine that had been linked to the Ukraine during the period when Nikita Khrushchev was Secretary General of the party, and a Ukrainian himself. He said, why not enlarge the province a bit, not for any bad reasons, but just to give them some feeling of strength, and we think about you. So the West, all the scholarship, American scholarship, in particular Mary Surratt's book, Not 1 Inch, shows that the US gave verbal promises to the Russians, as did the Germans. We are not going to expand NATO towards the east. Not 1 inch was the phrase used by James Baker. And the first phase of Russian leaders believed them. Gorbachev believed them, and Yeltsin did more than believe them. He just sort of followed their advice and instructions closely. And the US got used to that. Then the Russians elected Putin, who, by the way, however much he may be denounced in the Western world, was for a long period incredibly popular in Russia. This people have to remember. Otherwise, you can't understand anything. Putin was a popular leader with mega support, 60%, 70%, more than any other Western leader. Not because he invaded other parts of the neighboring world, but because he brought some element of stability into a country that had already collapsed. And that's something which Jeffrey Sachs now admits, that we basically screwed the Russian people. And, if they respond like that, one shouldn't blame them. And he could have added, if their leaders respond like that, we shouldn't blame them. So that's basically what happened. And as far as the recent war is concerned, NATO had been prodding, provoking. There's just masses of evidence for that. The current head of the CIA warned when he was head of the CIA in Russia. He said the one thing the Russians will not tolerate is any attempt to drag Ukraine into NATO, etc. They will not accept it, and whoever you speak to, whether they're Putin supporters or people who loathe Putin, they won't tolerate that. It's ironic, this guy was head of the CIA, and now he had to organize his own country against the advice he had offered 10 years previously. So Putin's patience snapped when he saw how close they were to putting Ukraine into the NATO bag. And he surprised everyone, including many of his own supporters, by going for it, where he made a huge error. And so it became a semi-demented belief that, fed by his intelligence chiefs, that the war wouldn't last more than 2 or 3 months because half the Ukrainian population would come over to Russia. Now, anyone with any understanding of Ukrainian history, leave alone being the head of Russian military intelligence, how the hell did they reach that conclusion? It's true, there was support for Putin, years ago, and then the Americans toppled that government by a semi-fake uprising, and Victoria Nuland from the State Department went and formed the new government in the Ukraine. I mean, that's what happened before Zelensky was elected. Yeah. So there were problems, but by this invasion, the Russians have antagonized their own people and their own supporters. So there's, at the moment, according to all my information from Ukrainian and Russian socialist friends who follow it very closely, I think there's hardly any support now for Russia. America's won. They don't need to continue the war. They need to sit down and get Putin to negotiate. He will never, ever take the Ukraine now, full stop. And I think, that is probably true. So what is Putin going to do? Who knows? I never thought he would be foolish enough to send his own armies in to try and take the whole country. Just crazy. It didn't make sense. And then these demented remarks about nuclear war, saying, if necessary, you'll use nuclear weapons for what, for God's sake? And now the Americans are saying we shouldn't, the latest military documents coming out of the United States saying that we will no longer have any negotiations in which we give up the first use of nuclear weapons. The American establishment is divided, by the way. Some of them believe this was a huge error to isolate Putin and provoke him because our real enemy is China. That's a strong view among sections of the US establishment, including from Brzezinski, who wrote the Grand Chessboard and was Carter's national security. He says it's crazy to do this, what you've done. China is the enemy. And why is China the enemy? On traditional inter-imperial contradictions ground. That China is the country with the economy and a budget that frightens the United States. So they're building up pressure saying China's going to invade Taiwan, to which the Chinese, very rude bunch of kids who are called the wolves, who use the social networks very well, saying, don't the Americans realize that Taiwan is inhabited by Chinese people? Why should we invade our own people? I mean, we're not going to do that. So who are you going to invade and for what reason? I mean, these sort of debates are common, and the Americans, they, unlike the Russians who are weak at it, the Chinese, when they get the bit between their teeth, some of their attacks on Putin in the United States, which are not published in the West, but are very effective. They just attack the double standards non-stop. So, did China invade Yemen? What is China doing in Palestine? Did China do this? And meaning you're the guys who are doing that, and yet you attack Putin for behaving like you. I mean, the most recent statement was published in the New York Times by a former Chinese major, now a military officer, now studying at some academy in the in Beijing, at Beijing University. He said the Russians made a mistake doing what they did, but the Americans are now making bigger mistakes, and perhaps, he suggested cheekily, the only real mediators left are the Chinese state and the Chinese party, to try and sort this out before the situation gets any worse. And there's a lot of truth in that. So we shall see, James, is what I'm saying. It's a disastrous war. It's gone on for 9 months now. In my opinion, it's excluded that the Russians can win militarily. And the Ukrainians know that. So they don't want peace talks. They want to defeat Russia and and regime change. That is unlikely to happen as well. So it's people who are advising non-stop militarizing of Ukraine and non-stop supply of weapons are not doing the Ukrainians any favors, in my opinion. The big pressure should be to get them to the table. When Zelensky actually suggested this, curiously enough, several months ago, the United States said, no, why did you say you were prepared to talk to the Russians? We will not sit at the same table as Putin, i.e., the war is really a war being fought by the United States under the NATO mask. And the Ukrainians, whenever they make initiatives, are told, you can't do that. We haven't approved that. So it's a really dreadful situation. And the peace movement has been very small. Though I will point out that there have been big demonstrations in Prague demanding an end to the war.
Yes.
And with anti-NATO slogans being chanted. And 4 days ago, there was a smaller gathering in Dresden, similar, stop the war, stop NATO. So slowly but surely something is building up. And the reason may not be pure, because they know their winter is nearly there. And given what the prices are going to be of fuel, people are scared they'll die. I mean, it's as straightforward as that, except in Britain, where the pro-war crowd doesn't mind if nuclear weapons are used at all. I mean, people say what it must be like for the poor Russians being in a country without an opposition party. I could say the same about Britain. There is no opposition.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the most sort of really striking things about the whole situation and about the sort of the portrait of the different interests and readings of the situation that you've just outlined for us is the total absence of the left in all this. So, I mean, even those anti-NATO demonstrations and that rise of anti-NATO feeling that is in evidence on the European continent, those are petty bourgeois uprisings. Those are shopkeepers and small business people who are actually taking politicians at their word when they say, yes, you're going to have to make sacrifices, but isn't it worth it to liberate Ukraine? And these shopkeepers are, for perfectly legitimate material reasons, are responding to that. No, actually, we're not happy with that deal, and we're never consulted. Now, the dereliction of all this from the left is something we've been covering on this show, and maybe we can sort of dig into it a bit. But before we do that, could you sort of refresh the memories of our listeners and also fill in people who are too young to have really known it was happening at the time? Let's go back to the anti-war on terror movement, this extraordinary uprising of an international anti-war movement in resistance, particularly to the Iraq War. It was a genuine mass movement. It was led from the left, including by yourself, and it commanded masses of support from across the political spectrum. And it was fed into with generational wisdom from previous waves of anti-war movement, going back to the resistance to Vietnam and 1968. Well, we'll get into the negative comparison with what we have today, but maybe you could just give us a bit of a kind of recollection of like how that looked when it coalesced and how it felt when it came about in the early 2000s from your perspective.
Well, I think the overwhelming feeling in Europe, mainly Western Europe, and the United States, which I visited a lot, was don't trust your politicians, they are lying. And so it was a sort of very strong belief that their politicians were lying, that there weren't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which is the excuse they were using, that Tony Blair was completely out of his skull, saying that within 45 hours, our bases in Cyprus could be destroyed, and all this crap they came out. No one believed them, or very few people believed them. So the base was, and not because of anything the left did, the left was weak, as you know, but because instinctively large numbers of citizens realized, their instinct told them these politicians are lying. They want to drag us into another war. And the people were proved right. The big question is this. Millions marched in Europe, and millions marched, not on the same scale, in the United States. This, in the States, it's very important, because this was only, several months after 9/11 and the terror attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. So to have 100,000 people marching in New York against the war in Iraq, and 90 to 100,000 in LA, 70,000 in Chicago, at least 30,000 in most state capitals. It's incredibly moving, actually, really moving. And I saw some of this. And in Britain too. And then what happened was that the demonstrations were so huge and didn't consist exclusively of people on the left, but of ordinary people, liberals, soft conservatives, Labour supporters, that some of them genuinely believe there have been so many of us, there's no way they can go to war now. I tried to warn against this in my speech in Hyde Park that day, that, don't have any illusions about that. I think they will go to war. It's obvious they are going to. But for many people, that was a huge blow. And they just felt demoralized. And they never came out in such numbers again. Because they felt, not that they changed their minds on the war, but they felt, so even if we have 1 million people out on the street, it has no impact at all. So it was a sort of strange time, that, but at least it created the basis of an anti-war movement once again. But apart from Britain, the anti-war movement faded away everywhere else. It just went very quickly. So I think in the United States, it's building up a bit again with the threat of nuclear war. But I say this, I'm very proud from that point of view, that we managed to keep it going with demonstrations big and small. And so when the Ukraine erupted, there's no doubt we were going to do something. But this time, the support and Putin clearly being in the wrong. I mean, not that we stopped the war, didn't support him. We said his troops must go out. But the people felt that Putin has to be punished. Why they have this feeling, you have to delve deep into the psychology of England and what this country was. And of course, the cult of Churchill that was built up after the Falklands War. So the anti-war movement died down. It hasn't gone, thank God. We still keep it going, but it wasn't anywhere near what it was at its peak.
The anti-war, the early 2000s anti-war movement did have a sort of unexpected legacy on the right, where subterranean figures such as Alex Jones maintained a kind of anti-Bush and anti-globalist and anti-intervention stance that kept a kind of a certain anti-interventionism current on the American right. And of course, that was a big part of the rhetoric, if not the fact, of Trump's certainly the 2016 election campaign. I've sort of come to see both, well, COVID and lockdowns and the sort of management of consent over Western escalatory influence on the Russia-Ukraine invasion as in some way kind of punishment for some of what went on in the last decade of both right and left populism. In that time, we saw a great deal of popular heterodoxy in terms of what was possible in domestic policy, and a kind of drift whereby parties both of the left and the right were increasingly breaking with austerity and promising at least their constituencies greater spending. And we also saw, as in the case of Trump on the right and Corbyn and Bernie Sanders on the left, we saw much more criticism of foreign policy than perhaps we've ever seen in the West by high-level political figures. And that all had to end. And what we saw, by whatever causality during COVID, was a sort of restoration of technocratic, unquestionable governance at the domestic level. And what we've seen in the West's response to the Ukraine invasion has been a kind of return of the unquestionable moralism around foreign policy, whereby people are just scared actually to be heterodox or scared to question what is an incredibly powerful moral narrative about Putin's deep evil, even the Russians' deep evil, and what doesn't follow at all, even if you do accept that premise, the idea that flooding the region with Western money and weapons is going to improve anything. And the absolute cowardice and lack of leadership in the left right now, given what we were just a few years ago, given that we were preparing Corbyn for government, is just absolutely disappointing and absolutely extraordinary. You must have seen the ordeal of this letter submitted by House Congressional Progressive Caucus representatives last week by the Squad and other progressives in Congress, which made the most kind of milquetoast and qualified calls for diplomacy of just the kind that you're describing. Now is the moment for, only for the letter to be rescinded by the very left-wing Congress people who had submitted it, with all this absolute nonsense about, some junior aide accidentally hit send on it by mistake, this nonsense out of the thick of it, or Veep and so on. In the interim, David Frum, Bush's speechwriter, had defended the letter. People on the right had defended the letter, and yet even this letter that was perfectly defensible from the point of view of the most bloodthirsty interventionists was too much, and the left rescinded it. We've got a situation where actually, never mind the left not being strong enough, and never mind the left not taking leadership in the anti-war movement, is actively denigrating it by constricting what is sayable, even in the act of apologizing.
Yeah, this is true. And the same thing happened here when some left Labour MPs signed a letter, a Stop the War letter, and were forced, not by Starmer, though obviously behind the scenes he was threatening, by their own leaders in the Socialist Campaign Group, to withdraw their names, with people behaving really badly towards some of the women MPs who'd signed it. And it doesn't augur well for anything, that an authoritarian party structure is in the process of being put into place. And I think Starmer, who will probably win, will be even more right-wing than Blair and stuff, given the things he's saying now. Saying that backing the Tory government on demonstrations, a police intervention, banning demos which are considered this, that, and the other. This is what he's supporting now, leave alone when he comes to power. So it's a very depressing situation. And I think, my own position is that I can't vote for this Labour Party. This is not Bolsonaro versus Lula. This is Bolsonaro versus his wife.
Yeah.
Who's run the campaign. So, I'm certainly not going to be calling for a vote for Labour unless people live in those constituencies where they know that the MPs are at least social democrats.
I think it's vitally important that actually the British left, such as it is, does not make the mistake that the Bernie supporters made in absolutely throwing everything behind Biden, meaning that they're indivisible from him now. We need to keep our hands clean of Starmerism if we're to have any survival and any autonomy whatsoever. Whatever happens under Starmer won't have happened with our blessing. That is the most important thing, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this tradition of the left of just automatically voting Labour should be broken at some time or the other. I was really quite upset and shocked, because this marks a break even with the past of the parliamentary left, the way they were accepted not attacking NATO, the way they accepted the threats of the leadership not to appear on platforms with people attacking NATO. I have to say this. This happened at an anti-war rally I spoke at Conway Hall in London. And it's one thing the others doing it, but Corbyn asked to speak before I did. It's fine. We sometimes, it's not a problem. But he then sort of sent me a note saying, I won't be able to hear your speech. Clearly, he had been asked to leave the platform while I spoke. And this is not a personal thing as far as I'm concerned. It's a political issue that you've been suspended from the Labour Party. Hopefully you're going to stand as an independent, and I would certainly vote for you. Why do you have to cave in and become totally craven in the face of an ultra-right leadership that is now running the party, changing candidates at will, encouraging Tories to join the party? Why should you behave like that? And I never raised it with him, and I won't, but I was really angered. And for political reasons, saying, if this is how you get scared, I mean, heaven help us in terms of the parliamentary left. Every mistake in the book, and these bright young Asian women, Zara and Afsana Begum and others, and black women who have been fighting on good causes and making powerful speeches, are suddenly being educated by the Socialist Campaign Group leadership to capitulate, cave in. It's the best way forward. Really awful. That did not happen to the left in the 50s when the Labour Party was captured by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. They won a majority. It did not happen when left Labour MPs were critical, as they were, of NATO. The right at the time criticized them and argued. They didn't say you can't say that or you'll be expelled from the party. But that is all happening now. And the tragedy is that the left is going along with it. No doubt on principled grounds, we have to be careful now, wait till we win. If we don't do what they say, they'll deselect you, which is probably true. But this is not the way to actually. How do you fight back? I mean, when Corbyn was suspended, I wrote a blog saying this is the time for the Socialist Campaign Group, or a majority of its members, to stand up and say, repeat Corbyn's remarks for which he was suspended.
Yes.
So you would have had 25 to 30 people in Parliament being able to fight back. But they're so attached to the Labour Party. You know, it's like a umbilical cord made of piano wire. They can't break, they can't cut through. And this time, I think it's going to be a disaster, because the Labour Party has changed considerably. 200,000 people have left. The Corbyn levy has left the Labour Party. Where are they? We don't know. What are they doing? You know, this is the irresponsibility of the Socialist Campaign Group, not to offer any alternative at all. Why? Quite a lot of them are old lags like myself. What's wrong? You know, what are you going to get in these last years of your life? Why are you behaving like this?
Thousands of people gave 7 years of their life to that project, and we come out the other side, and not even Corbyn. I mean, that is a distressing story that you tell about. Even in you know, what is Jeremy Corbyn now? He's Oedipus at Colonus. Our figurehead has been cast out and humiliated and made a byword for racism by that disgusting man at the head of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. And even in that state, he still won't share a platform with a man who surely thinks identically with him, yourself, on
it's not a personal issue, James. It's
not. No, it's a political issue.
Yeah, it is. It's sad, actually, that this is how weak they are. But look, we've gone on longer.
We must wrap up. Tariq Ali is the author, most recently, of the 40-Year War in Afghanistan, and also the book we didn't quite get onto, Winston Churchill, His Times, His Crimes. Both of them are absolutely outstanding. The other term that I think is kind of hanging in the air here is the extreme centre, the title of the book that you put out in 2014, before that kind of left populist revival that we've all kind of lived through, the rise and fall of, but the extreme centre is back, at least as far as Britain and Europe is concerned. But we look nonetheless to South America for some hope. Tariq Ali, thanks so much for joining us on The Popular Show.
Thanks, James.